Spiritus Sancti. Missing anybody?
This way.
Put these in this box. All right, so we're on page 39. We're about to start talking about the Crusades when the exams interrupted us. So, indeed, page 39 there, you see about halfway down, a little bit less than that, approximately though, halfway down the left-hand column on page 39, but now the cry, God wills it, burst forth from the lips of thousands. So our author getting waxing poetic here, as he sometimes does. But that was, in fact, I might say, the rallying cry of the Crusades was, indeed, God wills it. So the day of the Crusades has come, and we talked about it before, but it was motivated by the fact that pilgrims, Catholics going to the Holy Land to visit the sites of the earthly life of our Lord, were being given a hard time by the Muslims who controlled those areas, by the Saracens. Who were Arab Muslims controlling those areas. So that was really the motivation for it. Before they started having that trouble, that there hadn't been any particular push for it. And it was not simply as a war to exterminate Muslims or anything like that, of course, or even just waging war against Islam for political reasons either. We'll see that actually very shortly after the taking of Jerusalem in 1099. Godfrey de Bouillon himself would actually receive other Muslims, other emirs, Muslim rulers of various other types besides the ones they were fighting, and actually forged alliances with them. So far from being any kind of a war to exterminate Muslims or anything along those lines, it was very clearly for the making safe the routes of pilgrimage, and once that was accomplished, then the fighting ceased. And the idea was, well, we'll forge alliances with anybody who's friendly. They were not less interested in forging good political alliances, even with people who didn't have the faith, would anybody at any other time be less interested in forging alliances, even with people that might disagree with. So, all of that. But just keep in mind that this is on the short list of things because of which people they used to attack the church, just to have something easy to reach for. The selling indulgences and the Crusades, looking upon bringing up those things even if people have no idea what they actually entailed or what indulgences even are or were, or the practices of the time were with regard to them, or the Crusades, what those are actually motivated by, against whom they were actually waged, or how they were actually waged, or anything else. People will reach for those things just as quick and easy ways to, for whatever reason, for whatever motive, to attack the church. It might just be following the bandwagon, so to speak, jumping on it. This is something that everybody talks about in a negative way, so people just follow that. It could just be as simple as that. And there's also the fact that crusade in general is a term that isn't used very nicely these days, that oftentimes it's somebody who's out of his mind or pursuing something in one way or another with excessive zeal, as though he's on a crusade. It's oftentimes meant to just use it a very general term to mean anything pursued with excessive or disordered or maybe just even insane kind of zeal. So it's a term doesn't have a great connotation in English, a crusade. It could be used positively, but many times it's not. Just keep that in mind. So we'll go into this a bit. So The very, very famous Peter the Hermit, monk of Amiens, was one who made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He saw the mosque raised by the children of the prophet. Of course, that prophet should be in quotation marks. That's a reference to Muhammad. They do call him that, but you can see when you look at it, it's almost amusing. When you look at the various things that what is actually contained in the Muslim religion, clearly Muhammad just ripped off of everybody who was around him. Just pulled different things and cobbled it all together into his own thing. They took this and that from different, for this from the Jews, this from the Catholics, and whatever else may have been around, and just piled it all together into his own thing. So the prophet, they refer to Muhammad that way. So he saw that the prophet, so the Muslims had raised, the children of the quote-unquote prophet, had raised a mosque on the spot of the once hallowed temple of Solomon. So hallowed, not hollowed, but hallowed. Hollowed with an O means to empty it out. To hollow something is to empty it out. To hallow, or something that is hallowed, is holy, made holy, hallowed. So the hallowed site of the Temple of Solomon, he had burned with indignation when he saw the Savior's sepulchre profaned by the emir's stables. So yeah, that is not a bad reason to be upset. When he left the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, bearing letters from the Patriarch Simeon for Pope Urban II, he promised the venerable pontiff to send him an army of defenders. So pontiff, it seems in this case, is referring to the bishop, the patriarch of the city, who is sometimes referred to as a pontifex. So he's probably using that to refer in that more general sense. Usually in English, you hear the pontiff, that means the pope and nobody else. But a pontifex is has a much more general connotation in English, and that probably of course, this book that we're looking at, this translation from French, may have come across a little bit differently. Sometimes you see that a grammatically correct translation can be wrong with regard to the sense, or at least the usage in another language. For example, you see this fairly often in different books. The soul referred to as she, and sometimes that's because, anima in Latin is feminine, somewhat arbitrarily, but that's feminine in Latin. Not a big deal, I don't think too much of it. But also in French, which has no neuter gender, everything has to be either masculine or feminine. Is also feminine, coming from the Latin. So sometimes you see translations, especially from books maybe originally in French, the soul referred to as she, whereas in English the soul is neuter, because the soul is not the person. I mean, philosophically, theologically, that checks out, that the soul should be neuter grammatically, because the soul is not the person. They say in heaven, we don't say that those are human persons. Of course, our lady is, her body and soul are both in heaven. But generally speaking, the saints are separated souls. They truly enjoy the beatific vision, but they are separated souls. They're not human persons, because human person is composed of body and soul. You separate the body and soul, the body becomes a cadaver, it turns to being dust. The soul continues to live on, the human soul being immortal and subsistent. It still, of course, lives on and is judged, and if, in this case of the souls of the blessed admitted to heaven, they truly enjoy the beatific vision, but they are not human persons, and those are separated souls. So the soul is entirely fitting that the soul be neuter in grammatical gender, it referred to as it. And in English, if you hear a soul referred to as she, you'd think that's the soul of a woman. Whereas those books, the spiritual books that you read, in which the soul is referred to as she, is being used in a general sense, referring to human souls in general. And so that's, of course, by usage incorrect. It'll lead you, it's misleading, even if grammatically correct, being translated from whatever language it was. It could be that in the past as well, in English, that was the common usage, but definitely current day, that is not the current usage. So, get to the point of writing sermons, refer to even if you come across a book, if you're quoting a book in which the soul is referred to as she, say it. Otherwise, people will get confused. So, right, I'm not sure I got onto that exactly, but anyway, that is a point to be made. So, okay, it's pontiff, because of pontifex. So you see that when you read rubrical books that are written in Latin, Martinucci, for example. You see the bishop, if he's describing pontifical ceremonies, which are in fact ceremonies carried out by a bishop, not necessarily the Pope, but by any bishop, the pontifical ceremony. He refers to the bishop, even if it's not the Pope, even if he's a bishop without jurisdiction, say a titular bishop, or titular bishops theoretically do, but just any bishop carrying out a ceremony, even if it's a bishop who doesn't have a diocese, for example, he still refers to him as the pontifex. Or could, in some cases. Some authors might be pontifex, others say episcopus. I can't remember at this moment which Martinucci actually uses, but in any case, you might see either one or the other. But either one is permissible, as is indeed indicated by the very label pontifical ceremony. That's carried out by any bishop in that particular way. There is even such a thing as a pontifical low mass, which is not what we do here each day. That involves, you've probably seen it, but it involves 2 chaplains. That's the pontifical low mass. So pontifical high mass is a whole other thing. So, not going too much down that rabbit hole. That's probably what he's referring to here, is just the bishop, the patriarch of Jerusalem. So in any case, Peter the Hermit kept his word. The Pope had already received from Alexius Comnenus, so the Byzantine, the Greek emperor, the most pressing calls for help. He convoked a council for the 18th of November, 1095, to meet at Clermont in Auvergne, so in France. 14 archbishops, 225 bishops, 90 abbots, the ambassadors of nearly every Christian ruler, and a countless throng of nobles and men-at-arms answered the pontiff's call. So here, pontiff with a capital P, that definitely means the Pope. So the church was able to hold the vast assemblage. A throne was raised in the midst of the public square, Clermont, or Clermont in French. In English, that's probably famous enough to be called Clermont. But in any case, Urban II was seated upon it, surrounded by his cardinals. Himself a son of France, the Pope trusted for the success of the great undertaking in the devotedness and gallantry of the French nation. So yeah, at this time, might say France is at its peak in various ways. The peak of it is probably the reign of St. Louis IX. But in general, the nation of France is at its zenith in the sense of maybe political power in some ways, but most definitely in terms of its devotion to the faith. These are the High Middle Ages that we're looking at, in the time period during which, in all the most important ways, things were at their best. Life was a lot harder then, for sure. It was not an easy thing to survive for long in the Middle Ages. But also, people at the time, they didn't mind that. And that was not their focus. Having, at least in Western Europe, the culture, generally speaking, being Catholic, people were acutely aware of what was most important, which was eternity, not this earth. Definitely, when you look at the things they accomplished, things that were accomplished, intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, clearly the intelligence was there to develop the technology that exists today. Clearly. In fact, the intellectual accomplishments of the Middle Ages, and philosophy and theology, that is far beyond. That requires far greater intellectual ability than to build any technological device that you can think of, any vehicle or device that we have available to ourselves today. And that is a far higher science. Philosophy, much as the highest of the natural sciences, just by definition, it's one of the first things you study in studying philosophy, is the definition of philosophy, the highest of the natural sciences. So if they excelled so well in that, and even just before getting into theology, which is of course higher still, but if they excelled so much in just the highest of the natural sciences, then of course they could have accomplished much greater things than they did in the lower ones, but they just weren't interested. They didn't want. The general desire was not to go in that direction. It was the later centuries in which people became much less interested in the faith, much less interested in even the higher natural sciences, that the lower ones began to be more developed. So that's just a fact of the matter. So, okay. Yes, at this time, France is most definitely, in certain ways, at its zenith. The height of its political power came under Louis XIV, but by that time, it was before the Revolution, of course, which broke out under Louis XVI, but things were less than ideal with regard to the faith during the time of Louis XIV, for sure. Things were worse than faith and morals. Things were not nearly what they were during the Middle Ages. Not as bad as they became later on, but not what they were during the Middle Ages. Okay, so a thrill of enthusiasm passed through the assembled multitude when they saw the pontiff's. Something went wrong there. Not sure. I have to look at that. But in any case, the eloquent solitary, Peter the Hermit, was the first to speak. He told of the profanations and sacrileges he had witnessed, the persecutions inflicted upon the Christian pilgrims at Jerusalem by the children of Agar. So that's the claims, of course, of the Muslims that Ismail, the son of Agar, one of the wives of Abraham, that he's supposed to have founded that religion. Whatever you want to say about the truth of that, and it was founded by Muhammad, obviously. But whatever you want to say about that, whatever is the truth, that is commonly how they sometimes tend to be known, the children of Agar. Who was he? It's one of those things that sometimes might confuse people, that the patriarch Abraham had two wives. Yet something that was actually possible at the time for a man to have two wives. Polygamy is contrary to the secondary end of marriage, not the primary end. And so there was a time when it was permitted because the earth was in need of population. But interestingly, the opposite, the polyandry, or the practice of one woman having multiple husbands, is contrary to both ends. It's contrary to the primary end of marriage. So it was permitted at a time for a man to have many wives, or multiple ones at least, but it was never allowed for women to have multiple husbands. Just a note on that. All right, so he told, so the children of Agar, one of the ways of referring to Muslims in general. He says, I have seen Christians heavily ironed, dragged into slavery, put to the yoke like beasts of burden. I have seen the oppressors of Jerusalem selling to the children of Christ the privilege of venerating from afar the tomb of their Lord, disputing with them the bread of wretchedness, and torturing poverty itself to wring a tribute from it. I have seen the ministers of the Most High dragged from the sanctuary, beaten with rods, and doomed to an ignominious death. So as he recalled the woes of Sion and the outrages done to the Christian name, Peter's countenance was sad and dejected, his voice choked with sobs, his deep emotion touched every heart. So he gives an emotional appeal, which works even when someone isn't saying something that's true. He was in fact speaking the truth here, and that could be verified separately from his word, but indeed, it gives a powerful address here. And we don't need to read the entire address of Pope Urban, but he himself appealed after that to the assembled multitude, and the crusade. The crusades began to be put into motion after that. So again, this is the first time that it really began to be used. The cry of "God wills it" for the rallying cry of the Crusades. All right, so the page 40, we'll move past that. It's good to read all of this, but we'll move past it. The right-hand column on page 40, the impulse was given, princes and serfs, lords and armed retainers all took the cross. So serfs, just for the record, just to be clear of what that is, it's not the same thing as a slave. A serf is a peasant, the members of the lower classes who are bound to the earth. The idea was that there was a responsibility. They had to have this. They had this piece of land that they could work, and they could not be separated from it. The idea was that they were bound to that land. That even if the land changed ownership by the higher nobility, they still had the right to stay on that land. And they were not to be separated from it. So it's not as though they were owned by somebody. They were considered bound to the land. They had to take care of it. They could live off of it, but they had to take care of it. And that was a system that actually existed in Russia until at least the 18th century. Most nations had done away with that system by that point. Still, the lowest, the Russia, which was always a little bit behind in various ways, maintained that until at least the 18th century. And actually, there's nothing really new under the sun. When communism came in, they effectively reinstated it. Because, again, serfs were bound to the land. They couldn't travel around without, of course, being allowed to. So in communist Russia, people had to have permission to travel from one place to another. They were effectively, once again, bound to the land. Yeah, being worse off than before, worse off than they were under the Tsars. They were effectively bound to the land again. And once again, nothing really new under the sun. One of the common ways of referring to the communist rulers of Soviet Russia was Red Tsars. In other words, they were just as monarchical as the Tsars ever were. But they were just under the title of making everybody equal and all that nonsense. But they also said, almost mocking themselves, that some are more, everybody's equal, but some are more equal than others. So everybody's not the same then. Effectively, it's interesting they would say that, almost mocking themselves in effect. He's showing that's all nonsense. And nothing more natural than a hierarchy amongst creation. So that's a whole nother story. It's an interesting one, but it's a whole nother story. So robbers and brigands came forth from their hidden dens, confessed their misdeeds, and promised to expiate them in Palestine under the banner of the cross. So that's interesting. There was not necessarily an amnesty, which is a kind of forgetting, then at least a promise of pardon for anybody, even this, robbers and brigands, outlaws, bandits, and the like. Okay, if you behave yourselves during the crusade, then you can you'll be pardoned for your troubled past, we'll say, if you go on this crusade. And of course, you could die on it, but if you take part in this thing and it's successful, then you'll be pardoned. Or maybe even if it's not successful, you have to look at the exact terms of it, but the idea is that you won't be prosecuted for what you've done in the past if you make up for it by doing this. So in the first glow of enthusiasm, numerous bands set out, led by Peter the Hermit in person, by Walter the Penniless, a valiant but needy Burgundian knight, and followed by, I'm not going to try to pronounce the name exactly, a German priest. But victims of their own undisciplined ardor, they never reached the land they sought, but left their bones to whiten on the soil of Hungary and Bulgaria. So that didn't work out too well. So the real and effective crusade was organized in various divisions under the most renowned and noble knights of Christendom. So we don't go through the whole list of them there, but these are all the names you see written here. All right, of course, Godfrey de Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, his brothers Baldwin and Eustace, Robert, Duke of Normandy, his brother William Rufus, who was King of England, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond, Prince of Tarentum, Robert, son of Robert Guiscard, Tancred, Robert II, Count of Flanders, Stephen, Count of Chartres and of Blois. Those are all very famous names associated with the First Crusade. So also notice that Ademar de Monteif, or Monteif, probably should be an L right there, Bishop of Puy, the pious author of the Salve Regina, interesting that is known, who's the author of the Salve Regina, accompanied the expedition as a papal legate and spiritual chief of the whole army. So apparently 600,000 crusaders were marshaled under the walls of Constantinople, and that is an enormous army, especially for this time. And that would be a huge army for any time, but this time, yes, absolutely enormous. So the Emperor Alexius trembled at the sight of this deluge of defenders. And the Christian ranks, drained by the garrisons left at Edessa and Antioch, so they did now take everybody the entire way. They did leave garrisons behind. They established multiple crusader states as they went, which were named for various famous places. Yes, Antioch, Edessa, Tyre, and Sidon. All of these different places had garrisons and governments established as a kind of a barrier, of course, to any further intrusions of Islam, but as a way of a protection along the route of the Crusades to the Holy Land. So the Christian ranks drained by the garrisons left at Edessa and Antioch, by the many bloody battles already fought, by desertion, by exhaustion and want, by plague and famine. So you numbered altogether 50,000, so probably 50,000. Something is wrong with the numbers here, but in any case, they eventually numbered 50,000. Then the march to Jerusalem. The army drew near the walls of Sion, barefooted, and chanting the words of Isaiah, Slevan Chakrutu Okolos Tuos et Vide, Onesisti Congregati Sunt Venerant Tibi. So applying those words to the crusade approaching Jerusalem. So whatever I think of those numbers, that needs to be investigated. They're definitely the city, was invested, and very famously in 1099, the general assault on the city was made, and they took it. The Crusaders managed to take the city of Jerusalem in what was proved to be ultimately, after multiple crusades, the most successful one. This was the most successful one. So you don't need to look at the entire description of this of the assault and the siege, but the long story short is that they finally took the city, and the piety of Godfrey had withheld him from the carnage since he had set foot in the streets of Jerusalem. Leaving his fellow soldiers at their work of blood, followed by only 3 attendants, he went unarmed and barefooted to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The din of arms had ceased, silence reigned throughout the streets and on the ramparts. The only sound now heard in the holy city was the chant of the penitential psalms, or the glad imitation of Isaiah, Slitamini cum Jerusalem, it should be it, exultate in ea, omnes qui diligitis eam gradete cum ea gaudio universi qui lugeti super eam. So once again, applying the words of the prophet Isaiah to Jerusalem at that time. The true cross, once carried off by Chosroes, who was a Persian ruler, Persian emperor, and restored by Heraclius, was exposed to their veneration. So that's a reference to the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. Not to be confused with the Finding of the Holy Cross. The Feast of the Finding of the Holy Cross is in May. The Feast of the Exaltation is in September. It's one of those double majors. It's a double major. The Finding of the Holy Cross is a double of the second class. The Exaltation is a double major that supersedes a Sunday. Most double majors get reduced to a commemoration on Sundays, whereas the Exaltation supersedes a Sunday because it's a feast of our Lord, obviously. So the Exaltation was, yes, that was the feast that's appointed to commemorate the occasion on which the emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius, back in the time when that Eastern Empire actually meant something, reclaimed from the Persian Emperor Chosroes, the Holy Cross, and brought it back to Jerusalem with the big, very same city of Jerusalem, the one that, in fact, the one that our Lord visited, the one that was around, the one was besieged by the Romans, the one that we're looking at right now was taken by the Crusaders, that exists to this day. That's how ancient the city is, the city of Jerusalem. It's the very same Jerusalem that the Emperor Heraclius there brought back the Holy Cross to, and that's what they're referencing right now. So the sacred relic was borne in triumphal procession through the streets of Jerusalem, as it was also on the occasion of the first exaltation of the cross, and then solemnly placed in the Church of the Resurrection. 10 days later, the unanimous voice of the Christian army named Godfrey de Bouillon king of Jerusalem. So the various different Crusader states had various gradations according to the feudal system in place at the time. Jerusalem was appointed to a kingdom. It was given that status. And fittingly, obviously, it's the most prominent of all the cities. It's still coveted to this day, in fact. And that section of the Middle East is still the most hotly contested real estate on earth to this day. And when you think of that part of the world, we tend to think of deserts and everything very dry. Some parts of it are, but actually very, very nice. When you look at, say, there's one particular area, the Golan Heights, that are have been fought over by the Israelis with Arabs and all those people living there. It's very nice. If you see a picture of it, it's very nice, actually. It's not just desert. It's not. Yeah, yes, there is desert in that part of the world, but it's not by any means completely so. It's actually very beautiful. Not to say that deserts have a certain stark majesty to them, but it's not the same thing as more lush scenery. All right, so they carried him, as Godfrey de Bouillon, in triumph to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where he pledged himself by oath to respect the laws of honor and justice. When they would have invested him with the diadem and royal insignia, the Christian hero put them aside with the words, "Never will I wear a golden crown in the city where the Savior of the world was crowned with thorns." So that is definitely edifying. And the founder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem contented himself with the modest title of Defender and Baron of the Holy Sepulchre. So yes, that is indeed some admirable humility there. The conquest was organized, and the new Rome divided into the countries of Tiberias, Tripoli, Galilee, Joppa, Tyre, Caesarea, Beirut, and Heraclea. So, I mean, the Crusader states were organized according to the feudal system in place in Western Europe at the time. So the precious monument of feudal jurisprudence, the Assize of Jerusalem, reduced to a system, the administration of the new Christian kingdom by fashioning it upon the mode of the feudal system of the European nations, as we just said. So the successful issue of the First Crusade threw the whole of Christendom into a transport of enthusiastic joy. The happy tidings reached Europe a few days after the death of Urban II, who was thus denied the happiness of witnessing the realization of his highest and dearest wish. The pious and zealous pontiff held 2 more councils, one at Bari, in which St. Anselm eloquently proved the procession of the Holy Ghost, against the Greek envoys of Alexius Comnenus, and other at Rome, which confirmed the decrees of Clermont. All right, so by carrying out, in a case, the Crusades, Urban II accomplished one of the greatest designs of St. Gregory VII, who had wanted to do that. You may remember that when we talked about the reign of St. Gregory VII. That was one of the things he wanted to do to bring about the Crusades, but he was not able to. His reign was taken up with all kinds of other problems, as we saw, mainly dealing with the ever troublesome Henry IV of Germany. And we'll say, actually, that his son, Henry V, was no better. So, while these nightly expeditions opened the way for warlike souls to deeds of glory and renown, pious retreats were also provided for the hearts led on by special grace to a life of holy solitude. So, St. Robert, abbot of Molesme, founded the celebrated monastery of Citeaux, so a famous name, a famous monastery, with 28 religious who were resolved, like himself, to follow the rule of St. Benedict in all of its primitive rigor. So this is something you see, not where that necessarily happened with the Benedictines, but oftentimes it happens that orders are founded usually by a saint, according to a specific rule, and then over time, the observance of that rule, they get various permissions and dispensations, whether for good reasons or not, but they get them, definitely, absolutely speaking, legitimately so, by the authority of the church, but whether for good motives or not, whether those were sought to begin with, for worthy purposes or not, is another thing. But through such processes, over time, many times the initial rigor of the order, and therefore the fervor and piety of its members, tends to wane. It's just fallen human nature tends to go that route, and many times it has happened. And so oftentimes it takes another saint to bring it back to its original rigor. That's St. Teresa of Avila, a prime example of that. In fact, it's almost thought of as a separate order, not technically, but almost so. Very famously, she started the Discalced Carmelites. Then, discalced meaning ones who don't wear shoes. The Carmelites were originally supposed to wear sandals. Not that they went around with nothing on their feet, but they were supposed to wear sandals. And relaxing that rule, they started wearing regular shoes. And St. Teresa of Avila was the one who brought it back to its original rigor, following the Carmelite rule, and as it was originally meant to be followed, according to which they would not wear shoes. And it was actually there was a lot of conflict in that. People, for whatever reason, there was a lot of opposition to that movement in Catholic Spain, a lot of opposition to this initiative of the Discalced Carmelites. So, St. John of the Cross was effectively imprisoned at one point, had to escape from wherever he was being held. And he was somebody who apparently didn't meet in person with St. Teresa of Avila many times, but they worked very closely together towards that end of bringing back the initial rigorous observance of the Carmelite rule. And the Carmelites are called the Carmelites, by the way, in reference to Mount Carmel, which, of course, where the prophet Elias is supposed to have started that life, their religious life. So they claim to go all the way back to the prophet Elias. That's even in their Roman breviary, which, of course, that's not an infallible declaration of that claim, but and it has that at least behind it. Certainly, that's not to be taken lightly by any means. The fact that that's in the very liturgy of the church, the sacred liturgy, and I believe it's at the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, actually, that is that's related. That this the Carmelite order that started there will also go back to the prophet Elias. So there's in the Old Testament there was a religious life. It was it's different from the religious life in the Catholic Church as we know it today, but it was always something that people wanted to do, was to pursue perfection in the spiritual life in solitude. That is not by any means a new idea, or one that even predates the earthly life of our Lord. So grace has always moved people to do that. So the religious of Citeaux were called White Friars, from the color of their habit, in contradistinction to the Black Friars of Cluny, another very famous monastery, which was largely, I think, destroyed in the French Revolution. But anyway, it's still quite impressive to see. So the pontificate of now Pope Paschal II, from August of 1099 to January of 1118. So that's quite a long pontificate, especially given this time period we're looking at. Given how people would come and go very quickly. In the Middle Ages, we'll say people's grip on life was rather more tenuous than it is now. You could die much more easily. Just keep in mind silverware. The reason why silverware was eventually invented was because silver apparently kills different types of bacteria or whatever it is, causes foodborne illnesses on contact. The idea being that was necessary, otherwise your food might kill you. For modern day food preservation, that's something we just take for granted. Put something in the refrigerator, okay, it'll be fine. But not only was there a time before that was readily available, there was a time before that was even understood that was necessary. So foodborne illnesses, people die of foodborne illnesses all the time in the past. So that's a whole other thing, but the term silverware is, perhaps today it's not, I'm sure you can still find it, but silverware was originally, indeed, in fact, made of, or at least coated in silver, because that was necessary to not die while eating. Because there was a good chance you might. All right, so Pontificate of Paschal II opens the 12th century and the difficulties raised by the question of investitures between the papacy and the empire. So the anti-pope Guibert, remember him, with a small number of obstinate partisans, still held out his schism at Albano. So after the election of Paschal II, he was expelled from even that last asylum and died, a lonely fugitive at Città di Castello in 1100. 23 years from the time when he first raised the standard of revolt against St. Gregory VII. Imagine that, devoting 23 years of your life to being an anti-pope. Talk about a waste of time. Almost pity the fellow. I mean, it definitely is to be, but hard to say, hard to make a claim he was in good faith. Nowadays there are these little fake popes who pop up here and there, and sometimes they're probably so dumb that they might actually be in good faith. But in this case, when you're revolting against a reigning established pontiff in a serious way, it's hard to argue for being in good faith. Hard to. So, well, you can't call it perseverance, but that is some very disordered, but at the same time very tenacious adherence, pursuance of an evil end there. 23 years. Anyway, still the death of Guibert did not at once give back peace to the church. A schismatic faction found him a successor, Albert, who fell into the hands of the Catholics on the very day of his election and was sent to expiate his ambitious pretensions in the castle of St. Lawrence. So that was put an end to fairly quickly. It wasn't killed, but it was captured and locked away as a would-be anti-pope ought to be, in fact. So Theodoric, who was sent to fill his place, met the same fate 3 years after and was confined to the monastery of Lara. A third Henrician usurper, in other words, anti-pope set up by Henry IV or Henry V, by Henry IV it seems. His son Henry V was no better. A cleric named Maginulf, who assumed the title of Sylvester IV, was driven in disgrace from Rome and died in exile in a state of deepest misery. So Henry IV or V was involved in each of those, but then Henry V of Germany announced his intention, so the son of Henry IV, announced his intention of going to Rome to receive the imperial crown from the hands of the Pope. After 4 years of preparation, he set out, 2 words there, for Italy at the head of a formidable army. Every city that offered resistance was burned and razed to the ground. So, not R-A-I-S-E-D, but R-A-Z-E-D. Razed, destroyed. I always thought that sounded funny, though. Razed to the ground. If you know the correct spelling, it's okay, but if you're not aware of the difference between those two homonyms, words that sound the same but are spelled differently have different meanings. If you're not aware of the difference between those two, then you'll think it sounds very strange. Anyway, the advancing host spread terror and dismay before it, and marked its passage by blood and ruins. Henry spent the Christmas festival, so the Christmas season, of 1110 in Florence, and thence arranged with the Pope by letter the conditions of his coronation. So they were as follows: on the day of his coronation, Henry shall make a written renunciation of all the right of investiture of churches. He shall pledge himself to the Pope by oath in presence of the clergy and people to its observance. He shall swear to leave the churches in the peaceful enjoyment of their property. He shall confirm the Holy See in the possession of its estates and fiefs, and that's the correct pronunciation of that, by the way, fief, after the example of Charlemagne and his other predecessors. So that sounds good, and we'll see where things go wrong. On these conditions, the Pope shall crown Henry V and acknowledge him as emperor. He will help him to maintain his authority in Germany and forbid the bishops to usurp the regales or to do anything prejudicial to the rights of the prince. So by these terms being duly drawn up and signed by both parties, the king made his entry into Rome on Sunday, the 11th of February of 1111, preceded by an immense multitude of people bearing green boughs, palms, and flowers. But the public rejoicing was doomed to a speedy fall, and we'll see why. The Pope awaited Henry on the steps of St. Peter's. The king would not enter the basilica until he had surrounded it with his troops. That's never a good sign. Who also held every post in the neighborhood. So that's looking pretty ominous already there. Thus, backed by his armed followers, he called upon Pascal to keep his promise, so the Pope, and to proceed to the ceremony of the coronation. The Pope replied that, according to the Convention of Florence, Henry should first give up the pretended right of investiture. But then the German bishops, lackeys, who were proving here just to be lackeys of Henry V, declared that the Convention of Florence was null, that it was an open contradiction to the divine precept, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And that is just a joke. I don't even need to explain that. We will explain it to the extent of saying that Caesar has no right to give ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which is symbolized by the investiture. So this is so render it to Caesar thing. That's not Caesar's thing. And that's about all you need to say about that. That's about all you need to understand. So beyond that, that's a joke. To make that claim is a complete and utter joke. That is not to be taken seriously in the least. The Pope declared that he would never crown a perjured king. So remember, Henry, they made those oaths, and now he's going against them. So perjuring himself. The whole day was consumed in parleyings, that's an older term, but in a negotiation back and forth, trying to sort things out. The Pope stood unshaken. That began in St. Peter's, one of the most shocking scenes recorded in history. Not the only one like it, unfortunately, but one of the most shocking in history, that's fair to say. The soldiers broke into the sanctuary. The Pope guarded in a low, narrow dungeon. Many bishops, clerics, and laymen share the same fate. The Germans plundered the sacred vessels, the costly ornaments with which the sanctuary had been decorated for the coronation of their king. So this is just beyond low. The Italians who strive to defend the outraged majesty of their pontiff are stripped, beaten with rods, and thrown into close dungeons. Many of the inhabitants perished in torments, victims to the unbridled brutality of a licentious soldiery. Soldiery tends to be that way anyway. The account of these cruel outrages and of their pontiff's captivity had in the meantime roused the whole city. The Romans retaliated most fearfully, furiously no doubt, but fearfully. They massacred the Germans without stint or pity, so that is an imbalanced reaction. Understandable, perhaps, that those impulses would be there, but that is disordered. And furiously threw themselves upon King Henry's troops. Prince himself, they really asked for this. I mean, that's not to justify it, but they sure did call it upon themselves by behaving in what they did to begin with. What did they think would happen? they must have clearly they miscalculated the devotion, gone astray certainly, but they clearly miscalculated the extent of the devotion of the city to the Pope, or at least its dislike to being intruded upon like this. So the prince himself was unhorsed by the violence of the attack and wounded in the face. He probably owed his life to Otto, Count of Milan, who threw himself into the thickest of the contest and succeeded in drawing out his wounded master. So, if they, it seems, based on this description, it seems to be an imbalanced reaction. But, I mean, in a case like this, it would definitely be justified to fight back. It has to be done in a balanced way, it has to be proportionate. But in itself, it would be justified to fight back. But from the way they're talking about a massacre, that means, usually, that means killing also people who can't, who are incapable of defending themselves or ought not to be included in the killing. Okay, in any case, Henry hurriedly fled from Rome under cover of night, dragging with him his august prisoner, stripped of his pontifical attire and bound with cords like a common felon. For 2 months, Paschal II was subjected to the most fearful threats and cruel treatment, but his unbending firmness remained unconquered, and he would not acknowledge the king's right of investiture. So for at least that while. The bishops of Italy made a last appeal, representing to him the wretched state of the captives, whom Henry's tyranny kept in chains, far from their home and from the objects of their tenderest affections, the desolation of the Roman Church, deprived of nearly all its cardinals, the danger of a schism, which would renew all the horrors of war, in addition, of course, to the spiritual evils contained in there. So at length, overcome by their tears, with which he freely mingled his own, the unhappy pontiff exclaimed, well, you have the words there, but essentially gave in on the question of investiture. And we'll explain that, what kind of problem that includes, but definitely not one of teaching heresy. So it's just something that, given the fact that this has been addressed, is maybe why R&R types don't bring up this particular instance, this particular example. But also, on the other hand, I still find it somewhat surprising they don't, because it's not something you would expect them to know the correct explanation to either. So, we'll look at this, just to see what exactly happened. But he gave in on this. So a preliminary treaty was then concluded between the two parties. And on the 3rd of April of 1111 AD, the Pope signed the bull granting the right of investiture in these terms. So you have the exact wording of it there. That you may give the investiture by the crozier and ring to the bishops and abbots within your realm who have been elected freely and without simony, so with that proviso, and no one may be consecrated without receiving the investiture at your hands. So, I'll look at the footnote there. We don't have to read the entire thing, but definitely this included no dogmatic definition. I mean, that's beyond doubt. And actually, Bossuet points out, interestingly, and he's correct in doing so, that this was, of course, obviously something extorted from him under duress. And not just on that title alone is really null and void. So, that's a good point made by Bossuet. We notice here that if this had acknowledged the collation, the granting of the spiritual authority by the temporal power, that would have been heresy. That would have been to grant something that would have taught heresy. Because teaching this can be done was not only by explicitly laying out a document laying out the doctrine in question, but also different things can be made clear by what the church allows. Doctrinal conclusions can indeed be reached by looking at what is contained in the sacred liturgy of the church, for one thing, most definitely, and the prayers as well as the actions of the sacred liturgy, but also in what the church permits. Now, for example, one little example, that's a little example, but one example that comes to mind nowadays is that Pope Pius XII allowed, it required an apostolic indult to actually, for it to be valid, but that he allowed priests who are not bishops to confer confirmation in certain cases. And so you can see from that practice of the church, clearly, the fact that it seems from that, there's no other explanation, that is a power that a simple priest already has to confer confirmation. that's been debated in the past. That's something that only a bishop has the power to do, or is it a power that is contained in the priesthood, and that just the authority of the church does not allow a priest to use, even to the point of to the point that it's invalid without the approval of the church to do it. But it seems that it must be a power that is already conferred in priestly ordination, even upon a priest who is not a bishop. And that it could not be otherwise, because it has been practice of the church to grant a simple priest who has not undergone the ceremony of episcopal consecration still to do confirmations. So it seems that it must be. There is no other possible conclusion. But that's an example. Yeah, that was probably not laid out explicitly in whatever documents granted simple priests to confer confirmation, but that's a conclusion that must be reached by looking at that practice of the church. So that's, in other words, this is why it's important for us to consider this question of lay investiture, that in this case being allowed and granted in a treaty by a pope under extreme pressure. Now, what exactly does that mean with regard to the doctrine at hand? So we'll come back to that next time. All right. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, subtuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix, nostra supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sed a periculis cunctis libera nos semper, virgo gloriosa benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.